Um, I want to kind of start and how healthcare became a national issue. So in 1991, Harris Wofford won a long shot bid for a special Senate election in Pennsylvania by almost 10 points. This was considered jaw dropping almost because he did this by centering healthcare and the rising cost of healthcare in his campaign. This special election was seen as a bellwether for the national stage and led to Democratic challengers for the party's nomination to center the campaign as well. This, of course, included Bill Clinton, who, after making healthcare central to his campaign, declared in his inauguration and shortly after that he would submit a healthcare plan to Congress within his first 100 days. He missed that deadline by a bit. And his plan would guarantee access to universal healthcare, which is kind of led to the framing of health security rather than healthcare. And it would also provide portability. One of the big reasons that healthcare became an issue in 1991 was the recession, the kind of recession of 1991 and 1992, and people realizing that maybe linking healthcare to employment isn't always the best idea. So to succeed where others had failed, Clinton charged then First Lady Hillary Clinton and his longtime associate and domestic policy advisor, Ira Magaziner, to assemble a task force of experts to develop what they would become the health security plan. This task force was meant to be a policy analysis dream team in such a way. And the plan was specifically designed to implement market solutions and preserve private insurance to court moderates and hew to the new Democrat philosophy that Clinton espoused. However, I kind of want to take a quick whiplash turn to 2012 and see how one candidate for the Republican nomination of that year, Rick Santorum, remembered that debate. This is a little loud in the first, so you might want to just lower your microphone.
Me as parents and what is best for my children. Now you'll have others say, well, we know better what's best for your child. I remember this debate, this was a few years ago. You may remember Ira Magaziner. He was the guy that designed the Clinton healthcare plan way back in the mid-90s. And he was on Meet the Press with Phil Gramm, the great witty Texas senator. And they were on going back and forth about the Clinton healthcare plan and about who cares for this and how good this is for your kids, whatever. And my Magaziner finally got frustrated and says, I care for your children as much as you do, Phil. And Graham looked at him and said, okay, you care for my children as much as I do? Yes. What are their names? You see, you know your children's names, right? You know their names. You know what they want. As much as the education says and Washington says they care, they don't, because they don't know your kids. They don't know all the special things. We have 7 children. They're all different.
So this is kind of, the legacy of this Healthcare Act and specifically the task force. And one of the things I find interesting about that is, he's not talking about policy. He's not saying, the HMO system of the managed care of this area would have provided, unnatural. No, he's talking very specifically about size of government and kind of these personal issues. And that's why, in looking at private foundations, the task force, and I'll explain it a little bit more in a second, was kind of an idealized way of approaching public policy. So the problem that political scientists mostly and a couple journalists have found with the task force approach is that it isolated the plan from those who would be needed in securing its passage. So the policymakers, the interest groups, including the AFL-CIO. And the Clinton administration had just spent most of its capital with that group on securing passage for NAFTA. And so, it was by creating this task force, you created a plan, but you didn't necessarily have the ability and the resources to make the plan across the finish line. Another political scientist, Jacob Hacker at Yale, says that one of the problems with the task force approach is that it's a policy analysis, not politics. And by focusing on policy analysis, you might have the best answer, but you're not able to kind of speak and kind of garner vast support by speaking to the values and kind of the moment of the time. It also makes it harder to compromise when you create an interlocking system. So I argue that the Healthcare Task Force is a telling example in understanding not only the role of private foundations in recent political history, but also the limitations and potential pitfalls that this type of policy research favored by foundations presents. Specifically, and one of the great things about the C-SPAN archive is you can see these kinds of, for lack of a better, or these policy experts interact with callers, as I'll show here in a bit. So just a quick little, explanation of why I talk about private foundations so much, and why, my friends would probably rather me stop talking about them. But foundations like the Ford, Russell Sage, Rockefeller, Carnegie, et cetera, supported policy research in pursuing their respective missions. So it's this idea that, yes, we can give money to, local nonprofits, but to kind of create lasting change, we need to look at creating policy, which kind of creates a very fine line, because in the 1930s, it became law that foundations were allowed to educate but not advocate. And those words are intentionally gray, and that became something time and time again that we were negotiating. When was a foundation just educating, and when were they advocating? And more importantly, for my research in a post-Great Society, post-1968, foundations grew in wealth and influence. And this is in part because of a more conservative turn towards a smaller government and a stressing of the associational model, in which foundations and non-state groups like churches, community organizations, or different types of government structures work and to kind of become institutions of the state rather than the federal government kind of bringing down a top-down approach. So specifically for this paper, I've looked at the Kaiser Family Foundation, the Henry J. Kaiser Family Foundation, which in 1991 underwent a very kind of drastic and unique turn to focus more specifically on healthcare, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. This was developed, and the Johnson Foundation was developed in 1972, and one of their core missions was to expand access to healthcare. So, the Clinton administration provided a great opportunity for both of these foundations to support their missions, but created new questions about when is it education and when is it advocating. So the task force itself, like I mentioned, was led by Hillary Clinton and Ira Magaziner, and it was composed of 511 members. And then there were actually some more members added on that grew. And one thing that became very divisive was the fact that the membership was initially kept secret underneath the top level. So there were 6 cabinet secretaries, including, and then Hillary Clinton and Ira Magaziner, and then a few key figures like Judy Fader, who we'll meet in a second, who were known to people. But this was an idea that we don't want the various working groups to be known to people. We don't want lobbyists to be able to meet them at lunch, try to work some special deal to add pork to the bill, or journalists pestering them, trying to, oh, this working group wants this working group, and setting the task force against itself. So this was kind of, by the Clinton administration, was seen as an idealized way of making policy. However, this secret membership led to a protracted legal battle. And again, it's kind of this double-edged sword, because it was, and especially, their reliance on policy experts, various stakeholders and physicians and practitioners was meant to provide legitimacy to the process, but the secrecy and the kind of outside influence, which I'll show here in a few minutes, kind of created a more divisive stance that many held. So just to kind of step back before I get into how these kinds of relationships were perceived, the actual relationships between these two foundations and the Clinton administration kind of come down to 3 key areas. One of these is not unique to the Clinton administration, which is this revolving door that we begin to see throughout the century between nonprofits, private foundations, universities, and government. So Judy Fader, who was one of the key members of the task force, is a typical example in a lot of ways. So she got a PhD in political science from Harvard. She's still a practicing political scientist. She then worked at the Urban Institute, a think tank that had a lot of connections to the Kaiser Family Foundation. Then she worked at Georgetown. Then the Pepper Commission, which was a bipartisan commission to overhaul bipartisan congressional commission to overhaul healthcare, which failed initially. Then in between, she worked in the Kaiser Commission to understand the future of Medicaid, then worked for the presidential transition team, then worked as an assistant secretary of Health and Human Services, in which she served in the task force. So it's kind of this back and forth between government service, private foundations, that one increases the influence of private foundations because they could become important way stations for these types of policy experts. So when they're, when somebody who is in office that doesn't favor their approach, they can go to a foundation. But when somebody comes into office, they can come into government. And then another one that became very divisive was the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation had a fellowship program in which they had 6 members at this time who were attached to various legislative offices. And all of these members then were sent, because the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation was focused exclusively on healthcare policy at this time, they were sent to work on the task force, but they were paid by the foundation. And so it became this constant battle. And this is the legal battle about secrecy also delved into this, as whether they were federal employees or if they were foundation employees. And again, this is more of a feature of policymaking by this point, right? You begin to see these types of relationships, not just in the Clinton administration, but also in Republican circles. So what kind of more specific and the more interesting, for me at least, is this memo I have that you might be able to see on your screen. This was, something I found in the Clinton Presidential Digital Library. And it's from the CEO or the president of the Kaiser Family Foundation at this point to the administration. And I just want to read, "Let me underscore again my willingness to be helpful with polls, media briefings, focus groups, or in any other way." So the Kaiser Foundation is still seen as kind of a clearinghouse for public, for information concerning healthcare and polling. But here they're specifically offering the Clinton administration any type of help that they may need, and asking questions about a mandate or a type of policy that the administration might be pursuing. And the assistant to the president for the domestic policy on this wrote that the Kaiser Foundation, and Altman specifically, is a true friend of the administration. So you have these relationships, and again, these are relationships fostered on both sides of the aisle. And then finally, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and their mission to expand healthcare access spent millions to raise awareness of the issue, including the most kind of galling, if you are on the other side or opposed to the bill, was a $2.5 million slot of primetime NBC coverage. And then they spent another $1 million on top of that to advertise the bill, the feature. The programming itself was developed by the NBC News department, and Tom Brokaw was the lead anchor. And it featured Hillary Clinton, Bob Dole, and George Mitchell. And while it, had a variety of sides represented, a New York Times critic, television critic, said that Hillary Clinton was by far the star of the night. And then a C-SPAN caller reflecting on this event in the following week said that, this was, they said, and this was kind of an explosive mention, but they said that it was all but an endorsement for a single-payer healthcare system. And many people criticized this because not only they thought that there was no way this would be a balanced coverage because the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation had been so invested in kind of the task force's public hearings up until now. So I want to start with, or I want to not start, show this clip. This is Judy Fader, the Assistant Secretary for Health and Human Services and key member of the task force. And here she is on C-SPAN answering a question.
Expect to report sometime in late May.
Visalia, California, you're next.
Yes, I'm a doctor, and I would like to know specifically how many MDs are in the group. You've mentioned healthcare providers, but I want to know specifically how many MDs.
My recollection is that we have roughly 30 physicians participating. I know there are about 100 providers of various types. But we do have a number of physicians.
Also, I'd like to know why there's so much secrecy that has necessitated several lawsuits against your committee. And also, I would like to say that the 37 billion people uninsured is a fraudulent figure because these 37 billion can get health care anytime they want by going to any hospital?
Well, let's talk about first the secrecy you raised. I know we were charged with secrecy. I think that there were a lot of charges leveled, and one might want to look at why people might level those charges. We were, in fact, or have been, we are a very open participatory group that involves, although not interest group participation, a wide range of professionals, of experts of various kinds. We've been working with members of congressional staff, with members of governor's staff. I don't think a group like this has ever been assembled in government, and I think we expect to report.
So this is kind of typical of a lot of the conversations between members of the task force and C-SPAN viewers and callers. And here I have another letter that was sent in, and I'll just quickly. Our government leaders better be careful about more bureaucracy. Doctors are already being strangled with government forms. And so callers are in a lot of ways kind of echoing hackers' findings. They're focused more on issues of politics rather than policy analysis. So in this letter, you see size of government. And in the call, you heard specifically the question about what types of expertise is the task force employing. This was somebody who said, okay, not how many doctors or how many healthcare professionals, but specifically MDs, which shows that certain types of expertise are valued well above others. Because in other calls you hear people, really concerned about the relationship between their personal physician and what it will look like post the Clinton healthcare plan. The task force was met with suspicion, and we'll see some of that and where some of that may have come from. But this idea of why is it kept secret? Why can't we know? And the Clinton, and part of this was the Clinton image. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But in other calls, you hear people trying to just direct the conversation to totally different issues. So one caller says that, before we can do anything with healthcare, we have to solve our immigration issue. He used a bit different language, unfortunately. But so, again, it's more of a, is it politics or is it policy? And so the task force, in this kind of idealized way of policymaking, didn't seem to have the same sway that the Clinton administration had hoped. So here is a conversation between two U.S. Representatives, Representative Istuk, who you see here, and then Bob DeLay, who you'll see in a second.
Their conclusion can reasonable people reach? And this information, we were told by the administration, these are the best and the brightest coming in to talk about health care, and they have no special interest involved. I mean, they're only from groups like multi-billion-dollar groups like the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation and the Henry Kaiser Foundation that have been pushing through grants, multi-million-dollar grants all over the country towards the type of healthcare system that the Clinton administration has, that have interest in managed care groups. There were people from managed care groups, from medical clinics and hospitals and think tank type groups that were not federal employees, but they were all brought in.
Now,
and
wait
we
a minute.
were told that was the best and brightest. And they put together this plan, even though there are people who will profit from the Clinton plan that were involved in putting it together.
Would the gentleman yield? Would not the managed care groups profit from a plan as first outlined by Hillary Clinton, where managed systems would be set up, and in essence pushing aside any other sort of insurance and putting all of us under HMOs or the way they put it, managed care systems? So what in essence they did is they pulled people together that would reflect their own ideology and their own philosophy, and
would profit.
And with profit, pulling people together in secret to write this. And you talk. I watched the Whitewater hearings yesterday, and everyone was saying, well, there's no cover-up here. This certainly smacks of cover-up.
Let me tell you something that's very important.
So what he was about to say wasn't actually very important, but so the way that they use the task force and they use these connections to private foundations weren't in kind of this valued form of expertise, right? There's this long history that in some ways foundations were like universities, where affiliation to the Ford Foundation or the Kaiser Foundation was something to have on your resume that would help provide kind of an ethos appeal. However, they were seen as an undue influence. They're these multi-billion-dollar groups that are corrupting. And part of this is part of the larger political narrative that Republicans at this point were trying to push of the Clinton administration. So the connection to Whitewater is something that you see not only in this, but in others. Representative James Hansen also has another one where he not only connects it to Whitewater, but there's some brief allusions to Vince Foster's suicide. That not that the task force was somehow responsible, but it's again trying to paint this narrative of a corrupt and scandalous White House. And the thing is, though, and one of the things that shows it's in some ways more about narrative than it is about facts, is that Republicans favored a plan developed by the Heritage Foundation, which was one of the favorite funding sources for conservative foundations. And they worked with the Health Insurers Association of America on the infamous Harry and Louise ads, in which a couple is sitting at a table, trying to figure out how they're going to solve this. And I can get into the contract with America a bit in the Q&A, but really all of this kind of just brings into question the influence that private foundations can have, right? Because short of politics, what can they do? So with that, thank you very much.
Very good. So let's see if there's first for technical. Oh, we got Amber. Sorry, we got Amber before our Q&A. Obviously, she's got some comments on this paper. Welcome back, Amber.
Thank you, Dr. Browning. Thank you, Bo, for this paper and for this presentation. So the author notes that this paper is part of a larger dissertation project on the role of private foundations in American society. And I was really excited about this topic. I think this research is really useful to our standing up outside groups in the political process. Here we have policy groups that are not interest groups, and they're also not social movements, but they have a significant stake in particular public policies. So I think it's very useful for us to see where these foundations stand in terms of their influence, both in government processes and in influencing public opinion as well. So I'm looking forward to reading more of Bo's work as his dissertation moves forward. He completes a case study of two specific private foundations during the 1990s Clinton administration healthcare debate. I think this particular case study of the Clinton era healthcare policy is especially pertinent in the midst of our current healthcare debate. So as we're watching our current election unfold, aside from COVID, healthcare is one of the main topics we often heard talk about. So I think it's a useful reminder that the healthcare discussion hasn't gone away, and things that happened in the 1990s are still really relevant today. So I know this is part of a larger project for you, Bo. So it's possible that you get to some of my questions in other parts of your project. So these are just some questions or maybe suggestions from me. Again, I'm happy to send you an email with these written comments. So my first question comes from the role of the foundations themselves in the case of the Clinton healthcare policy. You mentioned that the foundations are acting in sort of a gray area of the law. They're allowed to educate on political issues, but they're not allowed to do advocacy for or against. And you give some historical context of the connections of the Kaiser Family Foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation with the Clinton administration. So my question is, does it seem then that the foundations were potentially acting in bad faith or outside of the boundaries of what is allowed in the law? Or was it just the perception that they were? You note that Republicans criticized the process and the inclusion of these foundations, but also that Republicans were using these same type of foundations to help with their own proposed healthcare plan. So this seems to be mostly just a winning narrative for Republicans. We know that legislators don't have to write policy themselves and that outside groups are often involved in political processes. I think it would be interesting to have some better grounding for how frequently some of these private foundations are involved in the actual policymaking process, or maybe some other examples of times when we know that they were really intimately involved in helping actually drafting policy. Some thoughts, you talk a little bit about the idea of narratives in your paper, so that Republicans have specific narratives, that there are narratives that come up with the callers who call into the C-SPAN archives. You mentioned about the narrative about foundations as part of the policymaking process or the perceived corruption of the Clinton administration that's put forward by Republican lawmakers and also callers into C-SPAN programming. And I'm curious, are you thinking that this narrative starts with Republican legislators and is a frame that's then picked up by the public? That there's kind of this frame contest that's happening between the Clinton administration, Republicans in Congress, and that Republicans are being more successful or doing a better job framing this issue, and that the public is sort of picking up on that frame, and we hear that kind of parroted then by callers into C-SPAN. Are Republicans able to really infiltrate public opinion in that way? The Clinton administration is somehow not able to use politics to frame what they're doing in the correct way. So we really have kind of a natural example of the way that elites are able to influence public discourse, and that Republicans are doing a better job in really influencing, I should say, this discourse. I also, your point about the C-SPAN callers, I think this is a really inventive way to use the archives. You're bringing the callers into the discussion. So we're bringing into, usually we think of the C-SPAN archives as being a place where we see politicians, cabinet secretaries, whatever, these are the people we see speaking. But actually through the C-SPAN archives, we can also get us like a little bit of a taste of what the public is thinking. So I really like that use of the archives in this paper. I think something that might be helpful in the context of your paper is to talk about who are the C-SPAN callers. So I think C-SPAN is usually pretty transparent on what they know about the demographics of people who watch C-SPAN on TV or even like watch it using the app. I think they have some pretty good demographic information you can access via their website. And I think that C-SPAN often talks about how, more so than a lot of other traditional news sources, they have a pretty demographically balanced viewership, especially in terms of ideology. And so I think that it would be interesting for you to include some of that in your papers, be like, C-SPAN callers, although they obviously can't represent the whole public, they can't represent all of public opinion because no sort of self-selected people calling into a program would be capable of doing that. We can say that it's likely that callers into C-SPAN are likely to span all of these different demographic groups. They're more likely to be ideologically balanced than people who are watching some other news programs. And I think that might even boost your argument a little bit. And also just kind of thinking about what can it tell us about some of the broader attitudes that are happening at this time. So like I said, I'm happy to send some of these comments by email. I really enjoyed reading your paper. I'm a regular NPR listener, so I couldn't help but read your paper and think of underwriting by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and like the NPR voice in the back of my head. So I will leave it to the Q&A then.
Thank you very much for those comments.